There, and we're recording session number 46. We'll be doing another minor prophet, Obadiah, and then jump into the book of Daniel, which will most likely take us a couple of weeks. Daniel is a big book and very important. To find Obadiah, you're going to want to find the minor prophets. They're at the end of your Old Testament. So if you find Matthew, you've gone too far to the right. If you find Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, you're too far to the left. After Ezekiel comes Daniel. And you might want to put a marker in Daniel because we will be getting there shortly. After Daniel, you've got the minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, and the fourth one, Obadiah. Now, Obadiah is hard to find because the whole book fits on one page in most of our Bibles. I've got 1.25 pages in my Bible, but I've got little pages. It's a very short book. It's only 21 verses long. And so Obadiah is unlike most of the other books of the Bible, in that when we quote Obadiah, all we have is a verse number. So we don't say Obadiah 1:16, we just say Obadiah 16. Little bitty short book. And Obadiah's message fits into the broader Old Testament prophetic message. And by that, I mean that there is a near-term application. There is a farther term application. So this dual focus that we find in most of the biblical prophets fits in Obadiah. As far as the far term application, there is a judgment that is apparent on the nations. There is a promise of the restoration of Israel, and there is a promise of the Messianic kingdom, the kingdom of Christ. And these things we've brought up before. I don't need to give you a timeline for this. Obadiah's emphasis is on the little bitty nation of Edom. I'm going to share the screen because I want to show you a little bit about what Edom is like. Here we go. That's Edom in the background there, actually in the foreground too. This shot is taken from along the main Jordanian north-south highway, just to the east of the Dead Sea. And as we look out into the broad expanse of the Jordanian desert, this area of sandstone canyons in the plateau of Jordan is the original site of Edom. Edom, as you'll probably recall, is the nation that rose from the brother of Jacob, Esau. Esau, whose name means red, sold his birthright for a bowl of red stuff, chili, I think, and then married some Canaanite women and moved off into the desert, into the land that we will eventually call Edom. The most important city in Edom by New Testament times was a place called Petra, and I'll show you a few pictures from Petra because that's kind of an interesting thing to look at. Petra is impressive, but it really fits into the intertestamental period. And Obadiah was looking forward to, or looking ahead, at the judgment of Edom. And that judgment would fall under the a variety of different national forces. But really the important thing for Obadiah is the very long term. Little detail here. Edom is a small nation east of the Dead Sea, south of Moab. The region is sometimes called Mount Seir, and it's just a little chunk of the Transjordanian highlands. It was occupied from at least the time of Esau, and probably before then, primarily by Bedouin. David brought the Edomites more or less under control around 1,000 years before Christ, but relations were often hostile all through the Old Testament period. There were some periods of subjugation, but it's clear that Edom was a semi-independent monarchy well into the Babylonian period and beyond. It was destroyed by a group called the Nabateans around 550 BC. And it might have been the result of campaigns by the Babylonian king Nabonidus. All of this is speculation. We don't know a huge amount about exactly what happened to the earliest stage of Edomites. But people continued to live in that region. The Nabateans were an important commercial tribe in the area. They're the ones who built Petra. Herod the Great, who was a kind of king of Israel during the time of Christ, was an Edomian. That is, he was an Edomite. He was a ethnically, he was a part of the people group of the Edomites. So there's a lot of connection there. Petra itself is down in one of the canyons that you see in this picture. The canyon right in the center of this picture is the location of Petra. The city itself is probably the largest monumental conglomeration of structures anywhere in this part of the world. It's a very, very important area. The Nabateans traded on both the spice route and the silk route, well up into the Christian era. They were major players. It is very, very likely that Petra was the original direction of prayer for the Muslims. When Muhammad commanded the direction of prayer, he said it is toward the holy city, but Mecca didn't exist when that commandment supposedly was made. And the oldest mosques that we have available had their Qibla, their direction of prayer, pointing toward Petra. So there's a lot we don't know, but it's all very interesting. It's kind of fun to speculate about who did what to who when. Okay, so a little bit of the authorship of Obadiah. There's only so many ways we can say we don't know anything. And I would try to convince you that this is a photograph of Obadiah when he was a boy, but that's not true. This is a picture of a little Bedouin boy and his mom at Petra. The people who live today at Petra are very friendly. They're very nice people. They're Muslim, of course, but the ethnic content is kind of unique. The hair color, the skin color, the facial features are very different from most of the other Arabic people groups that we find in the area. And I found them very, very pleasant to work with. The Jordanian government has forced these people to stop living in Petra itself so as to open the place up for tourism. And they live in a small community just outside the walls of Petra. And they come in every day to sell trinkets and counterfeit archaeological things. It really is all great fun. Obadiah's name means something like servant of the Lord, and that's a fairly common name. This is Indiana Jones. No, not really. The Bedouin who live and work at Petra are very well aware that the movie, when was that movie made? Back in the 80s. It's an old movie, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, was made at Petra. And one of the most famous scenes is the scene of Indiana Jones and his father and the rest of the heroes on their horses riding out of Petra. And so they still do that today, and they have these wonderful Arab horses, and they'll ride around. Sometime when it's appropriate, they'll take off at a gallop for the tourists. So this guy is Indiana Jones, and he's having a good day. The date and the occasion of this little book continue to be much debated. The book itself doesn't have anything at all to give a date for it. It's clearly a response to a time when Jerusalem was overrun by foreign armies, and when the Edomites were understood to have collaborated in the event. That could be 586 BC and the fall of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. It's as good a guess as any. As I've mentioned many times going through the New Testament, often our best answer to questions is we don't know. Yeah, this is one of those. The literary form is very straightforward. The book of Obadiah is not much to work with. 3 little parts. The first 9 verses give us an introduction to the relationship of Jacob and Esau, and thus Israel and Edom. 10 through 14 is specifically about Edom's violence against Jacob. Oh, how awful. And then 15 through 21 portrays the contrasting futures of Edom and Jacob in the last days. In all of this, there is a centrality to the concept of the day of the Lord. And at that time, Edom will be among the nations who will be judged. The point of the day of the Lord is judgment and blessing. The latter part of this book, from 15 through 21, looks at the blessings on Israel during the day of the Lord. So let's look at a little bit of this. I should show you this before we get to the outline. This is a satellite picture. I didn't take this picture, of course. I think this is from Landsat, or one of the big scientific things. This was taken about 20 years ago, and as you can see, it's Israel shot from the south. That's the Dead Sea in the center lower right of the picture. The Jordan River continues on to the north. You could see the Sea of Galilee just about halfway up the picture. The area that we call Edom, let's see if I can get this to pointer options. Let me make a laser pointer. That's not much better. Okay, this darker rock that we see around the right side of the Araba and the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is really dying. Here you can see the southern part of the Dead Sea is almost dried up. There's very little water left there. And off to the right, off to the east of the Dead Sea, this darker land form is some high ground. We always call it Mount Seir. And this is where Edom is located. Petra is about here, right about there. Another thing I really would like you to notice is this line. It's like a line drawn in the sand with a ruler on the map. And it looks like one of those maps that you would buy at the grocery store with different countries and different colors, but it's not. This is a satellite photograph of Israel and the neighboring Sinai Peninsula. And you'll notice that the Israeli side is darker. The Sinai is kind of brown and desolate, and the Israeli side is noticeably darker, and that color is actually green. There's lots and lots of vegetation growing there, lots and lots of things growing in Israel. Quite the amazing deal. The southern part of Israel and on into the Sinai is what we call the Negev. That's the southland. It also refers to the desert. When the Old Testament says that when the people of Israel come back into the land, they will make the desert bloom, this is what they're talking about. What we see here is the blooming of the desert that has resulted from 100 years of the immigration of Jewish people into the land of Israel. They have repopulated the land, they have repopulated the cities, they have learned to do agriculture in some remarkable modern ways, such that the desert is beginning to bloom again. If you look at this area, you'll see some little white patches over the Negev. Now, farther north, there are clouds. Those are nice big clouds, and those are coming in, and those will wash over the land. But in the south, years ago, we'd never see clouds because the land was simply too dry. There was no humidity to form the clouds. Today, the land has enough humidity that it's beginning to form clouds. And that's an amazing thing. The Israelis have gone into this area and quite literally changed the climate. They've made the desert bloom. And it's a very, very important move. Okay, let's go on to the outline of the book. The doom of Edom in the day of the Lord. Okay. Edom gets a bad rap because they generally have not been kind to Israel. Way back in Genesis, God says, I'm going to bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Edom has been a fairly consistent cursor, and therefore Edom is under the sentence of judgment for the end time. The specific judgment on the ancient kingdom of Edom most likely took place under Nabonidus, under the Nabateans. We think that's probably true. But the lists of the nations, plural, the Gentiles, who will be judged in the end time, in the day of the Lord, continues to include Edom. So now we've got two separate books in the Minor Prophets who are specifically focused on kingdoms that are neither Israel nor Judah, and a judgment on foreign nations. Nahum speaks of the Assyrians, and Obadiah speaks of Edom. The day of the Lord, I'll emphasize this one more time, is a time of blessing and cursing at the very end of time. It is, first of all, a judgment on the nations who are the enemies of Israel. Jesus in Matthew 25 talks about the judgment of the sheep and the goats. These are different kinds of kingdoms, those who have been helpful or a friend to Israel, and those who have been enemies. So this fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant seems to be a core to understanding so much of Old Testament prophecy. So there's a judgment on the nations who have cursed Israel or who have been enemies of Israel. Secondly, Obadiah makes a long, well, not all that long. Obadiah is short, it doesn't go for chapters. But beginning about verse 19, there's the promise of restoration for Israel. Those of the Negev shall possess Mount Esau, those of the Shephelah shall possess the land of the Philistines, they shall possess the land of Ephraim and the land of Samaria. Benjamin shall possess Gilead. The exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the Negev. Saviors, plural, judges or leaders of the people, shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. So there's a promise of restoration of Israel to the land. That's the greater part of this paragraph. And very much we see the physical fulfillment of the promise of restoration to the land. The people of Israel have returned in a big way. And they are in the place that they believe they belong. And many of the terms that are used here are still used today when we talk about what land the various parties to the disputes are arguing over. Judea and Samaria, for instance. Obadiah specifically says, they shall possess the land of Ephraim and Samaria. They'll possess Gilead. They'll possess the land of the Canaanites. They'll possess all of Jerusalem, all of the land of the Philistines, the whole land, including what we typically call the West Bank or the occupied territories. Those aren't occupied, those are part of Israel's heritage. And I believe that by the time of the Messianic kingdom, Israel will in fact possess all of that land as a part of the fulfillment of God's promise to them, all the way back in the Abrahamic covenant. But the most important thing, we've got a judgment on the nations, we've got the restoration of Israel, and there is the promise of the kingdom of the Lord. The Lord's kingdom is set up. By the time we get to the end of the day of the Lord, the kingdom of Messiah will be set up in Jerusalem over all of the surrounding nations, and most of us believe over all the earth. That last part, I think, is open to some conversation, but for sure, the whole region. The rest of the earth could hardly object, I think, but we'll see about that. Okay, that's Obadiah. Obadiah has some good details, but frankly, Obadiah is not unique. He's talking about the same pattern and the same fulfillment of prophecy as the other prophets have been laying out. That's going to take us then to the book of Daniel. Daniel is one of the most important of the prophetic books of the Old Testament as far as understanding the last days. I'm partial to the book of Isaiah for Isaiah's development of theology. I love the way Isaiah treats of the sovereignty of God and the deity of Christ. Isaiah is, for me, the high point of Old Testament prophecy. Daniel, on the other hand, is the high point of the Old Testament prediction of the day of the Lord. And in particular, Daniel lays out two great concepts, the time of the Gentiles and the 70 weeks of Daniel, which are 70 weeks for Israel. Those two concepts form two of the three great clocks of Scripture. I laid that concept out when we were in Ezekiel. Daniel expands tremendously on those ideas. Daniel lays the foundation in the Old Testament for a book that many New Testament scholars consider the most difficult book of the New Testament, which is the book of Revelation. Daniel's symbolism and his structure for prophecy answers numerous questions that I've seen in the commentaries on Revelation. Many New Testament scholars have a lot of trouble with the book of Revelation. It's very difficult. The symbols are not clear. Everybody wants it to apply to sometime during the 1st and 2nd centuries, but none of that is true. Revelation is actually quite clear when understood as a New Testament commentary on and fulfillment of mostly Daniel, but also to some extent Ezekiel and some of the other minor prophets. So what I prefer to do when I'm teaching biblical prophecy, I like to do a sequence through Daniel and Revelation. And the whole thing fits together, and we see how all of the details work. Frankly, a knowledge of the prophetic outline is not necessary for salvation. I consider it kind of an interesting sideline. It's not one of the hills that I want to die on. It's interesting, but not much beyond that. The book of Daniel, let's see some introduction here. We'll talk about the authorship of Daniel. The name of Daniel means God's judge. And we know rather a lot about him. He was a nobleman. He was born of royal blood. He was brought to Babylon with the first deportation by Nebuchadnezzar in 606 BC. He prophesied from the third year, that is 603 BC, until about 535 BC. So a long time. He was up and running for 68 years, which is a long career for anybody. So he was there through the entire Babylonian period and on into the Persian period. He was evidently a ruler over Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. He was a courtier and counselor of some importance under Nebuchadnezzar during the siege and then the destruction of Jerusalem. And tradition has it that Daniel won a lot of privileges for the captives in Babylon. And that's probably true. Critical scholars have long had trouble with Daniel's authorship of the prophecy on the grounds that the author appears to have detailed knowledge of historical events anywhere from 1 to 500 years after the time of Daniel's lifetime. And some of that we can really date well. There are some very, very specific prophecies whose fulfillments we can nail down historically. There are other prophecies that do not appear to me to have been fulfilled yet. Most of the critical prophets would not admit of any possibility of predictive prophecy. So Daniel can't possibly have known about anything that would take place after his lifetime. Therefore, the book was written by 6 other guys, also named Daniel, of whom nobody has ever heard. If you believe in God, who knows the end from the beginning, there's no reason at all to doubt Daniel's prophecies. Some Christians doubt them anyway because it gets them out of the work of handling all the details. Frankly, I don't blame them. If I were a little less disciplined in my study, I think I would join them. I've often told my students that one of the advantages of Reformed eschatology, like John Calvin did during the Reformation, is that the whole eschatology can fit on a note card. You could write it on the palm of your hand. It's very simple. Daniel's eschatology is not simple. There's a lot of details and a lot of difficulties and all kinds of critical issues to solve. So we're going to jump in anyway. I believe that Daniel wrote the book during his own lifetime. It was complete by about 535 BC. And I believe that Daniel was given visions of the future of the intertestamental period. He was given visions concerning the first coming of Christ and up to the crucifixion. He was given visions of the end time. Lots of details. He was also given details of the entire time of the Gentiles. We're going to have to talk about the time of the Gentiles. I've used that term before. I've introduced that as one of the 3 clocks of prophecy. And Daniel is all about the time of the Gentiles as the primary clock of prophecy. Now, by clock, I mean a timer that has a beginning point and which is counting down toward an ending point. The ending point is the second coming of Christ and the initiation of the 1,000-year kingdom age. All of prophecy looks for the inauguration of the kingdom age with the second coming of Messiah. And we find this is common all through the biblical prophets. The beginning point of the time of the Gentiles is disputed. Some would like it to be the age of the church, based on a passage in Paul. Paul talks about the gospel going out until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, and that's a message of evangelism, evangelizing the world, and I'm all for that, and I'm looking forward. Perhaps by the time I get to heaven, to seeing the fullness of the Gentiles come in. That's a very good thing. Jesus in Luke 21 predicts that the Temple Mount will be trod underfoot by the hostile Gentiles. He was speaking of the Romans at that time, who would destroy the temple. But he says these hostile Gentiles will trample the Temple Mount until the time of the Gentiles is completed. This is obviously a different setting. It's obviously a different implication. So we have to ask the question, when does the time of the Gentiles begin? I'll show you, when we get into chapters 1 and 2 of Daniel, I'll show you the precise point, the precise spot in time where the time of the Gentiles begins. And I think it's actually fairly obvious when we look at it. An important translation of Daniel that we should know about is the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Greek translation from the Hebrew Bible that happened around 300 BC in Alexandria in Egypt. The Jewish community there was given a commission by the Ptolemaic king of Egypt at that time to translate the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. And so we have this Greek version of Daniel. One of the most interesting details of the Greek translation of Daniel is that the people who made the translation apparently had forgotten a lot of the details, the linguistic oddities of the Aramaic language. Aramaic is kind of like Hebrew, and it's the language that most of Daniel was written in. They'd forgotten a lot of the meaning of the Aramaic terms. They actually mistranslated significant chunks of Daniel. What that means to me is that at 300 BC, the Aramaic language had already changed significantly since Daniel had written. That means that at least a few hundred years have gone by. Perhaps as many as 200 or 250 years had gone by. In other words, the book of Daniel that was translated by the Septuagint had been around since, strangely enough, the time of Daniel. And the critics have never been able to answer that problem. They prefer to believe that the book of Daniel was not written until roughly 100 to 200 years after it was translated into Greek in the Septuagint. So it's an obvious problem for the critics, but they never touch it. Let's look at the historical setting of this book. There's a whole bunch of history, and I don't think I'm going to put this all on the. I got a whole lot of history here, and I should probably open up something.
Is that somebody waiting to come in?
Oh, we got somebody that's wanting to come in. I've got somebody here. Oh my. Now I've got to turn it back into into automatic. Okay. Admit. Sorry about that. There comes somebody from my waiting room. welcome. Yeah, I'm thinking it might be helpful to draw you a picture here, so I'm going to. Not all of the dates make a huge amount of difference, but some of them are kind of important. Let's see if I can share content. Okay, I've got to kill this one first. Stop the share and move this out of the way so I can get to the stuff I'm after. Then here, get to there and there, whiteboard, okay. And then we'll make this one black. Here's a timeline. Like always, I draw lines all over everything. But see if I can make this any smaller. Nope, I cannot. Okay. Let's see, and I want to get out of this. What I'd really like is to get into that. Okay, the dates for a bunch of stuff here. 606 is the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's sovereignty over Jerusalem. So we're going to call the first period from 606 to 535. Actually, from 535 to 537, scholars disagree on exactly. But this is the period of Babylon. The king is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, which I know is easy for me to say. Some of the other kings are a little easier to talk about, but Nebuchadnezzar is the first king ever to attempt a real, honest-to-goodness empire. The Assyrians, often called the Assyrian Empire, but were never a real empire. In order to be an empire, it has to be a joining together, a coalition, more or less voluntary, of separate nations. By nations, as always, I mean different ethnic groups, different language and culture and religious groups mixed together somehow into a single vast empire. Nebuchadnezzar did this by what is usually called the melting pot. The melting pot idea of empire is to bring everybody together and make them all Babylonian. So the young noblemen of Jerusalem were taken off to Babylon, and they were given Babylonian names, they were given a Babylonian education, they were given Babylonian food, and it was expected that they would become Babylonian. They would get to the point that they thoroughly enjoyed all of their Babylonian perks. They would serve the king of Babylon forever. The next great historic change takes place around 330 or so BC. But from 535 to 330 is the empire that we call Persia. And the king is Cyrus. I've introduced Cyrus in the book of Isaiah. Cyrus is sometimes called Darius. Some people think they were actually two different kings and part of a coalition. Others think they were the same king. It doesn't really matter. Cyrus had the idea of the mosaic. A mosaic floor is a whole bunch of individual little tiles that form a great big picture. Cyrus had the idea that an empire ought to be built by allowing individual linguistic and cultural groups to do their own thing. So Nebuchadnezzar believed that the temple in Jerusalem needed to be destroyed in order that everything could be Babylonian. Cyrus believed that the temple in Jerusalem could be rebuilt because every ethnic group in the empire needed to be able to do their own thing. And that has the effect of creating a 70-year exile. From 606 to 537 is 70 years, and that's the time when Daniel begins praying for the end of the 70-year exile. Cyrus became the emperor, and one of his first moves was to send the Jews back to Jerusalem, ending the exile and setting up the mosaic of empire. The Persian Empire was really much larger than the Babylonian Empire and lasted quite a bit longer. The Persian Empire actually continues to the present day. Modern Iran is ancient Persia. Modern Iraq is most of ancient Babylon. But Persia co-opted all of what had been Babylon in Mesopotamia. And like Babylon, it controlled all of the Middle East. Persia controlled North Africa, it controlled big parts of Asia Minor, all the way to Istanbul. And to the east, Persia went all the way to the boundary with India. So Afghanistan was a part of Persia. All of this was one very large empire. The Persians invented one of the first postal services in the world, a kind of pony express. They had horsemen with way stations every so many miles. I don't know how far a horse can run in a day, but there would be way stations, and the horsemen would run from one side of the empire to the other in a week or so. It was quite the amazing thing. When modern people think of their post offices and the mailmen who bring the mail and what a great job they do, they should remember that this system has a very ancient foundation. That's under Persia. A point that I need to make is that God used an essentially secular, non-believing, pagan nation in Babylon to begin the 70-year exile and judgment on his own people, Israel. In the same way, God used an essentially godless pagan empire, Persia, under King Cyrus, to bring his people back and to reestablish Israel as a separate nation, more or less under the Persian Empire. It's an important principle to understand that God is never taken by surprise. God is working out a large plan, and his large plan comprehends all of the little decisions that national leaders and miscellaneous people groups make all over the world all the time. So Babylon is followed by Persia. Persia then got into, since Persia came all the way to the west, taking up all of Asia Minor, it eventually came into conflict with the Greeks. And the next great empire of the world is the Empire of Greece. So Greece begins as an empire around 330 BC. I say around because it didn't happen all at one time. And the key player is Alexander. Alexander the Great, the son of Philip of Macedon, invented a new way of doing the army. Alexander had the idea that small units could be used independently on the battlefield. And he preferred to have officers who were volunteers. The Persian army was primarily made up of slaves. So the Persian king would go out to battle and he would order his slaves into battle, and they would go off and do what slaves do, but generally without much enthusiasm. And the Persian army had to be used as one great big unit. Alexander was able to use his army as a combination of individually mobile units, divisions or companies or regiments. And he had officers at various levels. And those officers were able to make individual decisions on the battlefield. It's a very interesting idea, and it's built on the ideals of politics that were then common in Greece. Plato and Aristotle had laid the foundation several hundred years before of what we call the Western concept of human freedom, and that political leaders ought to rule at the consent of the ruled. So Alexander was not a dictator, or was not supposed to be. He was rather ruling with the consent of his people. And the individual officers in Alexander's army brought their own units of men. They were all armed individually. And it was a very democratic thing. So Alexander took over the world, but Alexander almost immediately, within 10 years, 10 or 12 years of the beginning of his career, he died. He was in Babylon and died. Some say he died of a cold, some say he died of something worse, but Alexander died. And he was left, or he left behind 4 generals. A general named Ptolemy, who took over in Egypt, a general named Seleucus, who took over in Syria, a general named Lysimachus, I know, easy for me to say, and another named Cassander. And I've forgotten where they, one of them was in Macedonia and the other was in another spot, but it doesn't matter because we don't run into them elsewhere in the Bible. But those 4 generals split up the Greek area into 4 separate kingdoms. So in a very important way, there never really was a Greek empire. It would be wrong to think of Greece as beginning an empire. It ended up being 4 individual units. And those 4 individual units were gradually eaten up by the next great world empire, which is Rome. The Roman Empire can be said to have started controlling the Middle East maybe around 166 or 67 BC, about the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. One of the last of the Seleucid kings is Antiochus, who is spoken of in the book of Daniel. And his stupidity in Israel led to the Roman control of the land that we now call Israel. So Greece and Rome really merged from one into the next historically. The Romans loved their Greek culture. They loved the Greek language. They loved the Greek philosophy. They loved the Greek temples. They even imitated the Greek gods. It's really best, I think, to speak of a Greco-Roman empire. Rome continues. The Greco-Roman Western civilization continues to control in the area of Jerusalem and in the area of Babylon until the time that Islam comes to power. The cross is right here, 640 AD, way over here. We're going to end up running out of space, but Islam takes over in Jerusalem and is the last of the great powers to overrun Jerusalem and trample the Temple Mount underfoot. Something I want you to understand is that the Muslim powers, the Waqf, continues to control the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to the present day. Since the fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar in 606 BC until the present day, Jerusalem has always been under the control of Gentile nations, and in particular, the usual suspects, the Middle Eastern and European neighborhood has always controlled Jerusalem all the way to the present day. And so it is, I think, important to say that Daniel is about the time of the Gentiles. And much of the prophecy continues up through, let's see, I'll put it in red. A lot of the prophecy that we're going to see in Daniel concerns this part, down to 167 or so BC. We see a few things after that time, down to the time of Christ. But following that, following Antiochus Epiphanes, the prophecies of Daniel are looking forward to the end of time. And it's significant to observe that Daniel is laying out a structure for understanding all of biblical prophecy from really from the creation to the second coming and into the kingdom age. Daniel has a very, very big picture. And this is what we're going to be looking at. As we get back to Daniel, we have to remember the Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then Islamic pattern to the time of the Gentiles, as that ultimately is what Daniel is about. And I'm going to call this the time of the Gentiles, the time of the nations controlling Jerusalem and Babylon, which is also important, but we're not going to worry about that right now. I'll show you why that's important. Okay, let me end this one. And I should probably save this. Just in case I want to come back to it. Let's see if I can. Okay, save. Can I save it? Okay, that just makes a new one, and now I've got a new one, and that doesn't help. Okay, sure. I just love doing this stuff. Sometimes it works better than other times. Okay, there we are. We're back in Babylon. This is where Daniel is set and all of the stuff that he does. The overall notion of the time of the Gentiles can be laid out on this chart. from 606 BC through the time of Christ, all the way to the end of history. The 7 that we see at the end of this image, we see it right here. That 7 is the 70th week of Daniel. It's the tribulation period that immediately precedes the 1,000-year kingdom of God. The farther we get into history and the more we see the rise of apostasy, the rise of the nations, the chaos of the world, the more it appears likely that God is getting ready to call an end to it all. When we get back together next Monday, we're going to start right out in Daniel chapter 1. The first chapter of Daniel is going to introduce us to 6 chapters of personal victories for Daniel. That'll be followed by 6 chapters of some of the heaviest prophetic material in the Old Testament. And actually, one of the chapters at the beginning, chapter 2, is very important for the prophetic visions of Daniel. And that's where we're going to start on Monday. We'll do some of Daniel's interaction with Nebuchadnezzar, who is, for my money, one of the more fascinating of the pagan kings of the ancient world. So I'm going to stop the share, see if I can. There we go. Now I'm going to unmute everybody so we can talk. Let's see if I can make it go back to gallery view. There's everybody. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Yeah, we love you guys. Here comes Donna.
Thank you. Hi, Donna.
All Dolly, Brother
Very
Willie.
much.
Good
Hi.
to see you all. Brother Oscar, you look like you need some sleep. Love you guys. We'll see you again on Monday. Have a good weekend, okay?
Okay, thank you, Dr. John.
For me. God bless. Bye-bye, Pastor Joel. Brother Willie, you love you, man.